guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about some books that I think are binge-worthy reads, books that I think are very compulsively readable, and books that I personally read very quickly. If I went into the synopses of each of these books, it'd be a fairly long video, so I'm going to keep that fairly brief, but we'll talk about what I think about each book and why that made it so readable for me. Many of these books are popular books in series that you might be familiar with, but you might not know that they just are like so compulsively readable. And I know a lot of people are spending more time indoors, more time on solo hobbies, and if you want to get sucked into a book because maybe you're going through like a reading slump or you just feel like you can't read during all the stress that's going on, I totally get that. And these are the kinds of books that will just get you through that because you can't put them down. Not all of them have like great literary merit. I'm not saying that all of them are just like the best things ever written, but for their readability, they're where it's at. The first is the Red Rising series by Peterfreund. I've only read the first 3 books. There are now at least 2 more in like a continuation trilogy, but this is the original trilogy, especially the first book, Red Rising. And Golden Sun too. I struggled a little bit more with Morningstar, but many people didn't. But these are adult science fiction, almost have a dystopian feel to them, but they're not a traditional dystopian. It's more of a utopia. And this follows just an uprising of people that are at a lower level of society, like a dystopia, infiltrating the higher level, and the first book is all about like a competition, almost like military competition, and winning all that. So it's a delightful time. These books are so sort of like stress-inducing at times, but also just like so readable, and that I would put them down and be like, I need to know what happens. Like I just need to know. I find the characters very fun, although they're flawed, and there's just constant action and twists and turns in this series. Next we have a book that I read way back in 2014. I actually have a lot of books that are like old throwback books that I read years and years ago when I first started BookTube, and that is Blood Red Road by Moira Young. This is a post-apocalyptic type world, almost has like a Mad Max type feel to it, and this is a YA book. This is a trilogy, but I was told by many people to not continue with the series, and that this one is just fine, which I'm totally fine with, and I now consider this a standalone. But this has kind of a post-apocalyptic Western feel to it. So our main character's brother gets taken by some like, I feel like they're like, it's like a warlord or something like that, and she goes on a quest to get him back, and she meets up with a band of characters, one of them that she has some really nice romantic banter with, and it's just great. Our main character is such a badass, and it's just one of those like road trip type quest stories, but again it's more road trippy because of the setting that is so interesting, because they're traveling through like a desert area, a lot of shit gets in their way, nature, people. I think she gets in a cage fight at one point. She has like a crow companion. It's so fun and so readable. Next we have a series that many people are familiar with, and I really recommend this series just for the readability, and that is the Folk of the Air trilogy by Holly Black, the first book being Cruel Prince. Many people are very familiar with this series. It's a young adult series that has to do with fae, and there's the hate-to-love relationship, and they're scheming, and it's in a very just like eclectic world and all of that. But there's just something about the writing of these that is just so readable, and I think what I've mentioned, I think in all my reviews for these books, is that the pacing, while some people would say it's off, and I do think it's kind of off, it's just so readable because of how quickly everything moves. Like there's just constant action, less so in the first book. Honestly, the second 2 books have more of this. The last half of the first book has it as well, but it takes a while to get into it. It's kind of slow at the beginning, but the things that happen, like horrible things will happen or stressful things will happen for the characters, but they're not in it for very long because the pacing is so fast. So even though you keep wanting to read because like things are happening and you don't want to know what happens, it's not one of those books where you get stuck in it so that it becomes stressful, because obviously times are stressful now and I don't want anyone to be stressed. But these books, like it just goes so fast. And then you have like the angsty relationship stuff, which I know a lot of people like. So the one I'm going to keep as a example on the shelf over here is The Wicked King, which is the best one. Then we have The Gilded Wolves by Rashing. This is a multiple POV young adult fantasy. It takes place in, oh, like what even is it supposed to be? 1889 in Paris, and again, fantasy setting though, and follows multiple characters, and you get all their backstories, and they're teaming up to steal a magical artifact, so it's kind of like a heist story. Of all the magical heist stories I could pick, like Six of Crows and stuff, I find this one the most compulsively readable. I think Six of Crows gets a little bogged down sometimes in this backstories, although I really loved it and I found it very readable. This one is just like even more readable and fun and all of that, so I found this a little bit more bingeable than maybe Six of Crows would be, also because it's a little bit shorter. I just love this one. I love any kind of heist story, honestly. I think most heist stories are very bingeable. Kind of like watching the Ocean's 11 movies. They're a delight. They're just something that's fun, and that's what I find about these stories. Also, there's a lot of like, there's an angsty relationship in here. There's a lot of good relationship dynamics. It's a good time. Then we have A Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is an adult post-apocalyptic, sort of like urban fantasy, but it doesn't take place necessarily in an urban setting, but it has that same urban fantasy feel. And this has Navajo folklore and mythology mixed into it instead of your traditional like Western culture fairy tale type stuff mixed in. And I find urban fantasy so compulsively readable. It's short, it's action-packed, there's a lot of tropes with it, and it's just like a very fun time. And I liked the twist on urban fantasy that this has, because like I said, a lot of urban fantasy follows your traditional like vampires, werewolves, things like that, and this had the different kind of cultural background, which I found really fun. But I find them fun because there's just certain tropes that some of them are problematic. You got to be careful with urban fantasy, but there's just things that you know, there's beats, there's narrative beats that you know are just going to come up, and that is very comforting and just very easy to binge. Another urban fantasy I found very bingeable was Stray by Rachel Vincent. This is another adult paranormal urban fantasy. This takes place in the South somewhere, I think, and it follows werecats. That series does have its issues, and I haven't gotten past the second book in the series, although I plan to, but again, urban fantasy is just so readable to me. There's a lot of like banter. There's some like problematic like alpha male type relationships in there that just tends to come with the territory. But that first book I think is like 500 pages and I read it in I think 2 days. So it's just so readable. There's usually like a mystery element going on to it. There's a monster hunting element in all of them basically going on, and it's just a lot of fun. Next we have Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is a standalone adult fantasy, and it is just fun and fast-paced. It has to do with a magical forest. There's something evil in the magical forest, and our main character ends up sort of teaming up with the curmudgeon-y wizard that sort of takes her captive at the beginning, because it sort of has this like Beauty and the Beast element. Basically she's chosen from her village to go and live with him, and no one really knows why, and he does this with girls every once in a while and whatever, and it's all very like sinister feeling. But she has to kind of team up with him. They have a lot of angst, although the romance is like the smallest part of the story. It's really just like a very fast-paced story about like what is going on with these woods and magic and nature magic and all the kinds of things that I deeply love and adore about magical wood stories. Then we have another throwback, and this is the original Shatter Me series. I have not talked about these books on my channel in probably years. This is a young adult dystopian series. The first book I didn't like. I thought it was kind of garbage, so I'm just going to put that back on the shelf. But you have to read the first book to get to the next books, and this has since continued on from the original trilogy and is now a 6-book series, but we're not going to talk about that part because I haven't read those books and I don't plan to. Although this sort of like pains me to put on the list because I know these books aren't like good, they are in my trash pocket as just being like so bingeable. Like I read each of these, especially like the second and third book, I think I read each of these in like one sitting or at least a day. It's that mid 2010s YA dystopian. There's a bit of a love triangle, but the love triangle part of it kind of goes away, but it is just that like angsty romance. The world building is not great. The world building's not great, but if you're interested in the romance, and that's why I read these books, is because I knew people were talking about the romance part of it, then you're gonna be into it. And it just like, you just inhale read them. Just inhale read them. I loved it. Then I just want to do a side tangent for a number of just adult contemporary romance books that are so readable. All of these I just enjoyed because I was so into the couple. So I'm not going to, again, go into all of the details with them. I've talked about a lot of these books before, but if I'm so into a couple in a romance book, I'm going to compulsively read them. Also, like, even bad romance books are very readable. Like, they're just easy to get through. So I recommend, if you have not tried romance, because I didn't try romance until last fall. If you have not tried romance and you keep like turning your nose up to it for whatever reason, there's a romance out there for everybody. And if you are really stressed out right now and you just want something that's like just easier but still good and still fun and still compelling and still has a lot of like really good qualities to it, read a romance. Like, romances always, as a genre, they end in happily ever after. You know things are going to work out. And what else do you need right now than to know that things are going to work out? Am I right? So romance is like the perfect solution for the stressful times that we currently live in. So some of my favorites, because again, I love the couple, I found it so readable, I love the tropes in it, whatever. The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. This is Enemies to Lovers. I think most of these are. Well Met by Jen DeLuca, which my mom is currently reading, so I can't grab it right now. One Day in December by Josie Silver, which is kind of like a missed connections. Two people see each other and then they don't meet up until later, and you follow them throughout their lives. They kind of keep not being able to connect, and it's angsty and wonderful. Get a Life, Chloe Brown, which is another kind of like bantery Enemies to Lovers. And if you prefer YA contemporary or contemporary romance, Morgan Matson books. Morgan Matson books are all fairly long, but are again, so readable, and they usually deal with like other issues and stuff, and I just find them like so compelling. I've read nearly all of them with a few exceptions, and I recommend all of them for being like very bingeable, fun, good, warm, soft reads. Then getting out of the romance category, we have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is an adult historical fiction-y type standalone, and it basically follows this very famous starlet who is getting interviewed now at like the age of 80, and she's never had an interview, and she is very famous for having these 7 husbands. So the whole book is going through all of these 7 husbands and her lives with them, and just her life in general through like the frame of these 7 husbands. And you find out very quickly that like she sort of shouldn't have had these 7 husbands. Like, she has a love earlier in her life, and you're kind of like, okay, so then why the 7 husbands? So it's so readable in that way. Like, that's what's pushing the story forward for making it so readable. The chapters are fairly short, and like it's just a very compelling story with really interesting characters and just so like viscerally real, and I just deeply enjoyed it. Next we have a controversial pick, but one that I was going through my Goodreads, all my read books, again, one that I read like a while ago, I think it was 2015. I was like, I read this so quickly and it was so readable, so I have to mention it. And that is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. This is a book that is a YA contemporary standalone and has like a mystery element to it. So this was a book that was very popular back when I was like first on BookTube and everyone was reading it, and then it started getting a lot of mixed reviews. People were like, it's very predictable. I think if you go into it now, like when the hype is way, way dead, no one talks about it, and just go into it like pretty blind, you'll probably enjoy it. I listened to it on audio and found the audio really compelling. I just found these characters to be like very intriguing to me, especially on the audio, and the audiobook narrator does a really good job of like having the emotion in her voice and stuff, and you're just pulled into the story. And I didn't really see the twist coming, but even if you do, I don't particularly think that it's like ruined in any way. So I really enjoyed this one, and that kind of like mystery element I think is really readable. Then we have another YA dystopian series, and that is the Under the Never Sky series by Veronica Rossi. This is again an early 2010s YA dystopian, but I found this to be less tropey. There's not a love triangle in it. There is a relationship, but I feel like it was very good and supportive, and like it was a hate to love, like opposites attract thing, but really good, and just a really strong, solid relationship without like a ton of drama in it. So I really enjoy that element, but just that like early, you know, YA dystopian, man. Like I know a lot of people right now are rereading The Hunger Games. So relatable. And I think that dystopians are very readable. I haven't read dystopians in quite some time, but there was something about them that just made you like gobble them up. Then we have another book that I haven't talked about in forever, and that is For Darkness Shows Us Stars by Diana Peterfreund. This is a sci-fi young adult retelling of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and Jane Austen's Persuasion books that are retellings of that are just so readable to me because there's this angst factor. It's these 2 characters, always because it's a retelling, these 2 characters that knew each other in childhood and were in love, and they were gonna get married, and then something kept them from getting married, and the guy character goes away, and then they reunite years later, and they're still very much in love, but they don't know they love each other, and it's just so angsty and wonderful. So you just want to get to the end where they admit that they love each other and everything's fine. So this was just a very fun retelling because I had this like sci-fi backdrop to it that I found really just fun and compulsively readable. So I would definitely recommend this, especially if you're an Austen fan. And lastly, we have another series that's very popular, and that is the Lunar Chronicles series by Marissa Meyer. And this is a YA sci-fi with some fantasy elements series that are fairy tale retellings. This is a series that I wouldn't call one of my favorites because I don't like remember a lot of it. I've talked about this before with the Lunar Chronicles. They're so readable, and I find them so fun and so fast-paced and so readable, and I'm invested in the characters, and it's so much fun, and then I put them down and I just like forget about them. Which is why I haven't read more of her series, because I just don't find her series like memorable for me, but they're so readable when you're reading them, and they're just like so fun and fast-paced. So the Lunar Chronicles is definitely a series that I binge read and that I think mostly anybody would binge read. So that is it for the books that I have binge read and that I think are good recommendations if you want to get, like I said, back into some books. You're going through a slump, things are stressful, you don't know what to read. These are books that I think if you were intrigued at all, give them a shot. So comment below and let me know some books that you find very readable and recommend some to me and other people in the comments. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.